When a steadfast farmer goes head-to-head with an overbearing, self-appointed HOA queen, a battle for personal freedom and community spirit erupts, proving that sometimes a little defiance is the best remedy. Welcome to our story. If you're ready, hit that subscribe button and join us as we dive into a saga of resilience and rebellion. Jake Mitchell had always lived by the simple creed, live and let live. His sprawling family farm, nestled at the edge of a quiet rural town, was more than a patch of earth. It was a legacy of hard work, perseverance, and generations of love. Every morning, as the sun's first light gilded the golden fields and the rich scent of fresh earth mingled with the soft clucking of chickens, Jake felt a deep sense of peace. But that peace was about to be shattered by an unexpected intruder. On a cool spring morning, while Jake sat on his weathered porch savoring a strong cup of coffee, he noticed a figure striding purposefully up the gravel path. Dressed in a crisp beige pantsuit and clutching a clipboard as if it were a scepter, the woman exuded an air of self-importance that immediately disrupted the tranquil rhythm of his day. It was Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of the nearby homeowners association. "Mr. Mitchell?" Karen's tone was clipped and businesslike as she halted at the foot of the porch steps. "You must be Jake Mitchell." Jake took a slow sip, his eyes twinkling with mild amusement. "That's me. And you are?" "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Crestwood Estates HOA, she declared, her voice leaving no room for doubt. "I'm here to discuss some serious concerns regarding your property." Jake leaned back in his chair, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Property concerns? I thought this was a farm, not a suburb." Karen's eyes narrowed as she produced a sheaf of papers from her clipboard. "Technically, your farm isn't part of Crestwood Estates, but it borders our community. We have received multiple complaints about the noise, the odors, and even the visual impact your operations have on our neighborhood. Your red barn, for instance, it's an eyesore, and your rooster's early crowing is causing quite the disturbance." Jake chuckled softly. "You want me to repaint my barn and somehow convince a rooster to hit the snooze button because it's too disturbing for your neighbors?" Her smile was thin, laced with impatience. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand that change can be difficult, but these are community standards we must uphold. This isn't personal, it's for the greater good." Jake's calm demeanor never wavered. "Karen, with all due respect, my farm has been in my family for generations. That barn is a symbol of our heritage, and my rooster, he's just doing what nature does. I don't answer to anyone's aesthetic guidelines, especially not yours." The tension crackled in the air as Karen's eyes flashed with a mix of determination and irritation. "We'll see about that," she said sharply before turning on her heel and storming back to her car. As the dust settled on the porch, Jake watched her leave, already anticipating the storm that was coming. He knew that Karen was not someone who would let a minor rebuff slide. That very evening, as twilight deepened into a velvet night, Jake's mailbox delivered an envelope stamped with an official HOA logo. Opening it, he found a list of alleged violations, from unapproved exterior colors to noise disturbances, all clearly designed to provoke and intimidate. The next morning, as Jake inspected his property, he encountered a pair of HOA board members flanking Karen by his fence. "We've been in contact with county officials regarding zoning issues," one of them announced in a measured tone. Jake's eyes hardened as he replied, "My land is in perfect compliance with agricultural zoning. I run a farm, not a manicured estate." Karen's voice dripped with condescension as she interjected, "We simply want to maintain community standards, Mr. Mitchell. Isn't that right? Standards? Or your idea of perfection?" Jake shot back, "I'm here to work the land and honor my family's legacy, not to cater to your overzealous fantasies of order." The exchange was interrupted by the sound of a rooster's crow piercing the tense air, a natural reminder of the very freedom Karen sought to suppress. Jake's resolve solidified in that moment. He would not let her oppressive demands trample over his way of life. After the encounter, as he walked back to his farmhouse, Jake muttered to himself, "This isn't just about a barn or a rooster. It's about defending the right to live free and honor our traditions." Inside his humble kitchen, While reviewing county documents and legal notices, Jake began formulating a plan that would soon rally the community and turn Karen's relentless crusade against her. The battle lines had been drawn, and as the first light of dawn crept over his fields the following day, the stage was set for a showdown that would shake the foundations of Crestwood Estates. Karen may have started this war with her rigid rules and relentless complaints, but Jake was determined to stand his ground. With every piece of evidence he gathered and every conversation he had with sympathetic neighbors, he prepared not just to defend his land, but to fight back, and to do so with every ounce of dignity and defiance his heritage afforded him. The following days brought a tangible shift in the atmosphere around Mitchell Farm. What had once been a haven of gentle routine now simmered with unresolved conflict. The relentless barrage of letters and unannounced visits had created an undercurrent of tension that spread far beyond Jake's property line. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones about the dispute, and the seeds of rebellion against Karen's strict dictates were slowly germinating. Early one brisk morning, Jake found himself in the middle of an unexpected congregation near the barn. A few local farmers, having grown weary of Karen's overreach, gathered with sympathetic expressions and a shared determination to support their longtime friend. Among them was Mason, a jovial man who ran the local farmers market, and Linda, a middle-aged neighbor known for her quiet but steadfast opposition to the HOA's oppressive tactics. "Jake, I heard about the new letter," Mason said, his voice low yet resolute. "Karen's escalating her campaign. This time, it's not just about your barn or the rooster. She's trying to control every inch of your life." Linda nodded, her eyes flashing with defiant empathy. "I've seen the way she treats everyone in Crestwood Estates. It's time we stood up for our rights. Your fight isn't just yours, it's ours." Jake, whose calm demeanor had begun to harden into unwavering resolve, replied, "I've always believed in living freely, honoring what's been handed down through generations. I won't let Karen's petty rules steal that from us. We'll show her that a community built on trust and tradition doesn't bend to authoritarian whims." That afternoon, while Jake met with a few concerned residents over coffee on his porch, a knock startled him. Standing at the door was Karen, flanked by two members of her HOA board, their faces set in expressions of barely concealed irritation. Karen's eyes burned with an intensity that belied her controlled exterior. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, her tone sharp and formal, "I must insist that you reconsider your operations. Your recent actions, hosting community events and altering the look of your property, are in clear violation of our aesthetic guidelines." Jake stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Karen, my property is not governed by your rules. I respect my ancestors' legacy here, and I'll continue to run my farm the way it's always been run. If you think hosting a market or planting a few sunflowers is a threat, then perhaps you're mistaken about what constitutes order and decency." Karen's eyes narrowed as she snapped, "This is not about your heritage, Mr. Mitchell. It's about the well-being of our community. When the sun rises, your roosters aren't the only sound disturbing our peace. It's the chaos you bring with these gatherings." A neighbor from the gathering, emboldened by the shared sentiment, spoke up from the back. "Karen, maybe you should learn that a little noise is better than living under constant fear of fines and unjust rules." The remark sparked murmurs of agreement among the small crowd. Not one to be easily cornered, Karen retorted with a cool yet biting tone. "I assure you, I am well within my rights to enforce these regulations. We are committed to maintaining a certain standard, something you seem to disregard entirely." The standoff was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Tom Caldwell, a familiar and trusted face in town. He had been monitoring the escalating situation and had come to offer a word of caution. "Karen, I've spoken with a few folks around here," he said evenly, glancing between the two parties. "I'm not one for getting involved in personal disputes, but I must remind everyone that trespassing and intimidation have legal consequences. Let's all try to keep this civil." Karen's expression faltered momentarily under the sheriff's steady gaze, while Jake's supporters exchanged relieved looks. The sheriff's intervention, although brief, had managed to defuse the immediate tension, but the underlying conflict was far from resolved. Later that evening, As twilight cast long shadows over the farm, Jake sat at his desk poring over county records and legal documents. His determination to defend his land was matched only by his resolve to expose Karen's overreach. He made copies of every relevant document and began drafting a response that not only refuted every baseless complaint but also asserted his rights as a property owner. Each word was carefully chosen, a quiet promise of retaliation in the face of injustice. Over the next few nights, word of Jake's preparations spread throughout the community. Support poured in from unexpected quarters, a retired schoolteacher, a local journalist eager for a big story, and even some former HOA board members disillusioned with Karen's tactics. Their whispered conversations in diners and town halls turned into fervent plans for a town meeting. The agenda was clear: to challenge Karen's authority and reclaim the community's voice. As the town meeting loomed on the horizon, a palpable sense of unity began to replace the isolation of Jake's struggle. Even as Karen's letters grew more frequent and her tactics more aggressive, the residents of Crestwood Estates started to see through her facade. The narrative was shifting. What had begun as a personal conflict was now evolving into a broader battle for the soul of the community. Jake looked out over his land, the fields bathed in the soft glow of dusk, and murmured to himself, "This is our home, our legacy. We're going to fight for it. Together." And with that, the stage was set for a showdown that promised to redefine the boundaries between personal freedom and imposed order, pitting tradition against tyranny in a battle that none could ignore. The day of the community meeting arrived with an electric tension in the air. The town hall, an old brick building at the heart of Crestwood Estates, buzzed with whispers and the shuffling of papers as residents took their seats. Word had spread like wildfire. Jake Mitchell was set to expose the overreach of Karen Whitmore and the HOA's unjust practices. The meeting was not just a forum, it was a call to arms for a community tired of being bullied. Jake stood at the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "This isn't just about my farm. It's about the freedom we all deserve. We have lived under the thumb of arbitrary rules for too long." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. In the front row, Linda nodded firmly, while Mason exchanged determined looks with several other residents. Even a few former board members, hesitant at first, now leaned forward with cautious optimism. Just as Jake was about to present his evidence, a stack of legal documents and copies of official correspondence, Karen strode into the room. Clad in her signature beige pantsuit and armed with a thick folder of her own, she made her way to a seat at the front. The tension in the room spiked as she took her place, her gaze cold and calculating. "Mr. Mitchell," Karen interjected sharply, breaking the silence, "while you paint a picture of victimhood, let's not forget that your actions have disturbed the peace and harmony of our community. We all have a right to a certain standard of living." Jake's eyes narrowed as he replied, "Karen, your so-called standards are nothing more than a means to control and intimidate. My farm has been part of this community long before you ever decided to dictate what is acceptable." A heated exchange ensued. Karen's voice, measured but edged with frustration, filled the hall. "I'm merely enforcing regulations that everyone agreed to abide by when they chose to live in Crestwood Estates. Your blatant disregard for these guidelines isn't just irresponsible, it's disruptive." A resident in the middle of the crowd, a soft-spoken woman named Barbara, raised her hand. "Karen, isn't it true that your complaints often lack substance? That sometimes they're based on personal vendettas rather than actual violations?" The room fell silent as Karen's face flushed with anger. "That's preposterous," she snapped, her tone brittle. "I have records and official notices. I'm simply doing what's necessary." At that moment, Jake leaned forward, his tone firm and resolute. "I have copies of county documents that prove my farm is in full compliance with agricultural zoning laws, and I have testimonies from county officials who visited my property. I'm not the one trying to impose my will on others. I'm defending my heritage." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a man named Richard, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should review the facts rather than rely on hearsay and personal attacks." His suggestion, though diplomatically phrased, carried the weight of dissent against Karen's authoritarian style. Karen scoffed. The facts speak for themselves. And the fact remains that your farm has negatively affected property values, at least according to multiple complaints from residents. Her words hung in the air, met with a chorus of skeptical murmurs. Mason, unable to hold back any longer, stood up. Let's be honest, our community is divided by fear and outdated rules. I've lived here all my life, and I've never seen anyone so intent on destroying the unique character of this area as you, Karen. A ripple of applause broke out among the residents. Even those who had been silently watching now seemed emboldened by Mason's challenge. Karen's eyes flashed dangerously as she slammed her folder onto the table. This is not a personal vendetta, she insisted, her voice rising. It's about maintaining order, preserving property values, and ensuring that all residents adhere to the same standards. Jake's voice cut through the clamor. Order doesn't mean suppressing our way of life. My farm is a living testament to generations of hard work. And if my way of life is wrong, then why does it bring so much joy and pride to our community? His words resonated, drawing nods and murmurs of approval from many corners of the room. The debate grew more intense as residents began sharing their own stories. Tales of petty fines, arbitrary rule enforcement, and the relentless pressure to conform. Every account chipped away at Karen's argument, painting her as the overzealous enforcer of a system that had lost its sense of fairness. As the meeting wore on, the mood shifted from confrontation to collaboration. Several board members expressed regret over how the HOA had handled things, while others admitted that perhaps Karen's methods had been too harsh. The collective voice of the community, once fragmented by fear, now began to coalesce into a unified demand for change. In a quieter moment, after the formal proceedings had ended, Richard approached Jake. Your evidence was compelling, Jake. I think it's time we re-examined how these regulations are enforced. This community deserves better. His sincere words gave Jake a glimmer of hope that change was possible. Outside the town hall, as the residents dispersed into the cool evening air, whispers of a new beginning echoed through the streets. Though the battle was far from over, the battle lines had been solidified. Karen's grip on the community was weakening, and the seeds of reform had been sown. Jake walked away from the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. The fire of defiance had been lit, and now, more than ever, he was ready to fight for his legacy, and for the freedom of every resident who yearned to live without undue oppression. In the wake of the explosive community meeting, a charged silence settled over Crestwood Estates. The echoes of dissent had not faded, they had grown into a clarion call for justice. Karen Whitmore, reeling from the public backlash, was determined to tighten her grip on the community even if it meant escalating her tactics to an all-out war against Jake Mitchell and anyone who dared stand by his side. It began on a humid summer afternoon. As Jake was tending to his fields, a fleet of black SUVs rolled up the dusty road leading to Mitchell Farm. The vehicles, with their tinted windows and stern-faced occupants, were a clear message. The HOA was not going to let this rebellion go unchallenged. Jake paused, wiping sweat from his brow as two sharply dressed individuals stepped out and approached the weathered wooden fence. Mr. Mitchell, one of them said in a clipped tone, I'm here on behalf of Crestwood Estates. We've received further complaints regarding your property. It appears your recent community events have disrupted the peace of our neighborhood once again. Jake's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward. Disrupted the peace? I hosted a farmer's market that brought the community together. What more do you want? Before the second agent could speak, a voice crackled through a handheld radio from one of the SUVs. We have orders to enforce stricter guidelines. You are now in violation of several county ordinances, noise levels, unauthorized gatherings, and unsightly modifications. Consider this a formal notice to cease all non-compliant activities immediately. The words sent a ripple of anger through Jake. You can't intimidate me with threats, he replied, his tone measured yet unyielding. I'm following every regulation in the book and I'll continue to honor my family's legacy. If you think you can force me into submission, you've got another thing coming. The agents exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. Mr. Mitchell, we have our orders. Refusal to comply will result in fines and possible legal action, the first agent warned. That evening, as dusk draped the farm in long, stretching shadows, Jake gathered with his closest allies in his modest barn. Mason, Linda, and several other neighbors who had grown fed up with Karen's relentless overreach sat around a battered wooden table. The air was thick with both exhaustion and determination. "We can't let them bully us into submission," Mason declared, his voice rising with fervor. "Karen's playing hardball, but she doesn't control us all. We have the county records, we have the evidence, and most importantly, we have each other." Linda, her eyes shining with resolve, added, "I've been speaking with other residents who have had similar run-ins. It's not just your farm that's suffering, it's our entire way of life that's under siege. We need to form a united front." Jake listened intently, nodding slowly. "I'm not willing to back down. This farm isn't just a piece of land, it's a symbol of our independence and our history. We need to show Karen that this isn't just my fight, this is a fight for every person in Crestwood Estates who cherishes their freedom." The meeting continued late into the night as they devised plans not only to counter the HOA's latest actions but also to turn the community's defiance into a force that even Karen could not ignore. Ideas flew around like sparks: organized peaceful protests, a petition demanding an independent audit of the HOA's actions, and even a social media campaign to expose the corruption behind Karen's relentless campaign. Every suggestion was met with determined nods and murmurs of agreement. The next morning, news of their plan had spread like wildfire. A coalition of local farmers, small business owners, and even a few sympathetic members of the HOA itself began to mobilize. On social media platforms and community bulletin boards, the rallying cry was clear: "Stand with Mitchell Farm, stand for freedom." Videos of Jake's impassioned speech at the town meeting circulated widely, igniting a sense of urgency among those tired of bureaucratic overreach. Meanwhile, Karen was not idle. In her pristine office at the Crestwood Estates headquarters, she pored over documents, her jaw set in a grim line. "We cannot allow this insubordination to spread," she muttered to herself as she coordinated with her legal team. Her phone rang incessantly with calls demanding action, each complaint a drop in an ocean of discontent. Determined to regain control, she decided to launch a series of surprise inspections at properties across the neighborhood, hoping to catch anyone who might dare support Jake in violation of the HOA's ever-tightening rules. That afternoon, as the sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt roads of Crestwood Estates, a small convoy of officials began their rounds. They knocked on doors, inspected lawns, and scrutinized every detail for any hint of noncompliance. Their presence sent shivers of anxiety through the community. Every inspection was a reminder of the battle lines drawn between the old ways of living freely and the new impositions of an overreaching authority. Later that day, as Jake was preparing for the next community event, a modest farmers' gathering designed to celebrate local produce and heritage, a young man named Tyler, one of the newer voices in the community, rushed up to him. "Mr. Mitchell, we've heard from several residents that the HOA is planning more surprise inspections. They're using this as an excuse to fine and intimidate us further. What are we going to do?" Jake's eyes blazed with determination. "We stand together, Tyler. Every inspection, every fine, every threat is a challenge to our right to live our lives as we choose. Let them come. We're ready." The words resonated far beyond the farm. Across Crestwood Estates, as residents prepared to face the onslaught of intrusive inspections, a newfound resolve took hold. In the face of escalating intimidation, the community was uniting, a diverse chorus of voices demanding the right to preserve their heritage and live without undue interference. And as night fell on the embattled neighborhood, the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, a silent promise that, in unity, even the mightiest force could be overcome. The war was intensifying, but so was the strength of the people standing for freedom. The tension that had been simmering for weeks finally came to a head on a crisp autumn morning. The air was filled with an almost palpable electricity, a mix of defiance, determination, and the quiet hope of a community ready to reclaim its identity. Jake Mitchell, now more than just a farmer defending his land, stood at the forefront of a united front that spanned every corner of Crestwood Estates. Today, they would confront the oppressive force of the HOA once and for all. At dawn, as the first rays of sunlight filtered over the rolling fields of Mitchell Farm, a convoy of local residents, farmers, and even disillusioned HOA members gathered near the boundary line between the farm and Crestwood Estates. Their voices, once hushed in fear, now rang out clear and strong. "Stand for freedom. Stand with Mitchell Farm." The rallying cry echoed across the fields, a symbol of the community's collective strength. Jake took a deep breath and addressed the gathering from atop a makeshift stage, a repurposed wooden pallet adorned with wildflowers and the proud emblem of Mitchell Farm. Today isn't just about defending my property, he declared, his voice steady and resolute. It's about protecting our right to live our lives without tyranny. We are here because we believe in the power of community, in the strength that comes when we stand together against those who would impose their will on us. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, their faces lit with hope and a determination that had long been buried under fear. Among the listeners, Tyler, Linda, Mason, and several former HOA members exchanged determined looks. They knew that the day would mark a turning point in a battle that had grown far larger than either Jake or Karen alone. Not far off, in a sleek, intimidating car pulled up at the edge of the gathering, Karen Whitmore arrived, flanked by a cadre of stern-faced inspectors and board members. Her eyes, once filled with unyielding authority, now flickered with uncertainty as she surveyed the sea of defiant faces. Determined to restore order by force if necessary, she stepped forward into the clearing, her clipboard clutched tightly in hand. "Good morning," she began, her voice carefully measured as she attempted to project calm control. "I see that you've all decided to make a spectacle of yourselves. This is an official assembly of residents, and I must remind you that..." Before she could continue, a booming voice from the back of the crowd cut through the tension. It was Sheriff Tom Caldwell, who had been a quiet observer until now. "Ms. Whitmore, it's time to stop this charade. We're not here to be bullied by a single person, no matter how official you may seem. The county has confirmed that your inspections and fines have no legal standing on these lands." A murmur of approval surged through the crowd. Karen's face tightened as she tried to regain control. "I'm simply enforcing community standards," she insisted. "Standards that all residents agreed to when they joined Crestwood Estates." Linda, standing close to Jake, stepped forward. "Those standards have become tools for oppression. Our community deserves a say in what our neighborhood looks like, and it certainly doesn't include intimidation tactics or baseless fines." Her voice rang with the quiet authority of someone who had suffered enough under Karen's relentless oversight. As the tension mounted, the once sharply divided crowd now converged on a singular point of clarity: their right to live freely and honor their heritage. A former board member, Richard, who had quietly sided with Jake's cause during the meeting, took the microphone next. "We have reviewed the facts. Our records show that Mitchell Farm is fully compliant with county regulations. Karen's actions were overzealous and unjustified. The community no longer tolerates these power plays." Karen's composure began to crack, and for a moment, her carefully constructed authority wavered in the face of overwhelming solidarity. "You can't," she started, but Tyler interrupted firmly. "You can't force us to live by your rules anymore. We're taking back our community." The words were like a final blow. The inspectors, now visibly uncomfortable, began packing up their gear. Even some of Karen's own board members exchanged wary glances, silently acknowledging that the tide had turned. In that charged moment, the balance of power shifted decisively. Karen Whitmore, the once feared enforcer of Crestwood Estates, found herself isolated and overruled by a community united by common cause. As the crowd cheered and the energy of defiance filled the space, Sheriff Caldwell stepped forward and addressed Karen directly. "Ms. Whitmore, I advise you to stand down. There's no legal basis for your actions today, and further attempts to intimidate this community will result in legal repercussions." Her authority, once absolute, had crumbled under the collective will of the people. Defeated, Karen's shoulders slumped. With a final, sharp glance at Jake, a look mingled with frustration and resignation, she turned and left the clearing, her entourage in tow. The crowd's roar grew louder, a mix of relief and triumph that reverberated through the crisp autumn air. Later that day, as the community gathered to celebrate their newfound unity with a spontaneous outdoor feast on the farm, Jake stood quietly on the porch, surveying the scene. Neighbors laughed, children ran freely, and for the first time in months, the spirit of Crestwood Estates was not defined by fear but by freedom. In that moment, Jake knew that their victory was not just his alone. It belonged to every resident who had dared to reclaim their right to live without undue interference. The final showdown had ended not with the clash of swords, but with the power of unity. A lesson that, in the end, True strength lies in community, tradition, and the unwavering resolve to stand up for what is right.